This episode is for all you guys that suffer over beginnings. I don't think anybody suffered as much as I did. When I first came to writing, beginnings were a nightmare for me, and I ended up turning it into a nightmare. I worked it and reworked it and put so many things from the different pieces of advice that I heard that by the time I was done, it looked like a war between Picasso and a monkey throwing paint at one another. If you could turn it into a painting, something along those lines would be what I achieved. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what goes into opening lines and the 3 different types of openings. Then we're going to crack a few books from different genres that I pulled off my shelf and see how that applies to the different genres, what they might have in common, and what's different, and look at some popular misconceptions as well. That's what's coming up on today's episode of The Story Detective. Stick around. Welcome back to my channel, and if you're here for the first time, then welcome aboard. The next few videos are going to be winding down my spring and summer season, and the fall and winter season is about to start within the next couple of weeks. So it's a good time to be here because I have some exciting new things I want to try on my channel, as well as upping the game on the old favorites that I've been doing so far. Because as I look back every 6 months of what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong, hopefully there's a growth and hopefully the channel progresses. And if you would like to subscribe and follow along, I would totally appreciate that. And if you find this video has value, don't forget to hit the like button on your way out. So what are the 3 basic ways to start any story? You're either going to come at a story through an interesting character, or an interesting situation, or an ominous setting. All 3 of these can and have been done well in almost every genre. So let's start cracking these books and looking at some various openings. Let's start out with some of my book haul from the last video. Game of Thrones. How does it start? Now, Game of Thrones is a series of short paragraphs because they're pretty much sentences in a conversation. Now, some people will say that you shouldn't start a story with a conversation, and that's something I heard recently a couple of times, and I'm here to tell you that that's pretty much bullshit. The only reason you shouldn't begin a story with a conversation is if you're bad at dialogue. If dialogue is not your forte and description is, then start it with description. I mean, it's kind of common sense. But if you can write really good dialogue, you're the next Elmore Leonard, and you think a conversation is really going to pick up your strong points, then by all means, start your story with a conversation. George R.R. Martin did. We should turn back, Garrett urged, as the woods began to grow dark around them. The wildlings are dead. Did the dead frighten you? Sir Waymar Royce asked, with just the hint of a smile. Garrett did not rise to the bait. He was an old man, past 50, and he had seen the lordlings come and go. Dead is dead, he said. We have no business with the dead. Are they dead? Royce asked softly. What proof have we? It's a conversation, out of the ordinary. Do you stop reading, or do you want to find out what they're talking about? It does pull you into the story through that conversation. You don't know the characters. There's not a great deal of description going on here. Now, this is another thing that pulls those factors in that we previously discussed. It's not an ominous setting, but the conversation has ominous portents. So here, we don't actually have a character, we don't have a setting, but we have something that's pulling us in a simple conversation. Is that conversation written like the next literary genius? Martin's writing is very good, but in this opening, did he dazzle us with a brilliant description? It's the conversation that does it. The conversation is the amazing situation. Not the words to dazzle you, but the conversation and the atmosphere and feeling behind it. Next up, we have The Cellberg Connection by Helen McInnes. Who the heck is Helen McInnes, you may be asking? This is one of the books that I mentioned that comes from a different period. It was written in 1968, and we're going to look at a couple of things. I chose this for several reasons. Helen McInnes in her day actually took over the mantle of the Queen of Suspense from Agatha Christie, which is not an easy thing to do. Now, we've all heard of Agatha Christie, but there's probably a lot of new writers out there that have never heard of Helen McInnes. The question is, should you have heard of her? Now, this woman was Scots-born. She moved to London to continue her studies. On her honeymoon in Europe, she visited Bavaria, which was occupied and ruled by the Nazis. She made notes, and she vowed to write about the oppression of the Nazis. When her husband and her moved to the United States in the late 1930s, her husband got a job at Columbia University as a professor, and she started her writing career. So what's so interesting about that? But what was this man and woman doing in Nazi territory on their honeymoon? That's where it gets interesting. Her husband was MI6, and even after they moved to the United States and he became a professor at Columbia, he was still an MI6 agent. So she had inside knowledge, and she was writing these books. They may be fiction, but it's a perspective on the time. She was also a woman during World War II and the Cold War era, a female writer who was not a popular thing at the time, that was a trailblazing writer in these categories. And she lived a very eccentric life. So let's look at what she did in her beginning. And this is an ominous setting. The lake was cold, black, evil, no more than 500 yards in length, scarcely 200 miles in breadth, a crooked stretch of glassy calm, shadowed by the mountainous sides, which slipped steeply into the dark waters and went plunging down. There were no roads, no marked paths around it, only a few tracks, narrow ribbons wound crazily along its high sides, sometimes climbing up and around the rough crags, sometimes dropping into sparse clumps of fir at its waterline. The eastern tip of the lake was closed off by a ridge of precipices. The one approach was by its western end. Here the land eased away into greater folds, forming a stretch of fine alpine grass, strewn with pitted boulders and groups of more firs. This was where the trail, branching up from the road that linked villages and farms on the lower hills, ended in a bang and a whimper, a view of forbidding grandeur, and a rough wooden table with 2 benches where the summer visitors could eat their hard-boiled eggs and caraway sprinkled ham sandwiches. Basically what she's doing is there's that ominous beginning. The lake was cold, black, and evil. And we show the calm, peaceful setting of where these people, the tourists, sit and eat their lunch. So it's bringing a little bit of the ominous setting into the day-to-day life of tourists, and we have the portent that something unpleasant is going to happen there. Definitely something, and someone that maybe we should still be hearing about today. Next up, we have a writer and a novel that needs no introduction. It's Anne Rice's interview with a vampire. Let's look at that beginning. "I see," said the vampire thoughtfully, and slowly he walked across the room towards the window. For a long moment he stood there against the dim light from Divisadero Street and the passing beams of traffic. The boy could see the furnishings of the room more clearly now. The round oak table, the chairs, a wash basin hung on one wall with a mirror. He set his briefcase on the table and waited. "But how much tape do you have with you?" asked the vampire, turning now so the boy could see his profile. "Enough for the story of a life?" It was very different in its day for a vampire story. The whole interview process I found intriguing. It's an idea that I played around with, stories that I thought could be like that. I think we all have. What if a mortal could actually sit and talk with a vampire about all that they've been through? If this entity really exists, how do they differ from all the myths? It has you on that right away. The fact that there's little details, the scenes, the settings in the room, almost a little bit of a literary flavor here. The wash basin, the mirror, a room that's caught in time, and there's something there that intrigues. You're not seeing that much about the character, but you know there's a vampire. The interviewer is actually somewhere around mid-30s, but to the vampire, that's still a child, which is also kind of interesting. You're not getting a lot of information, but you can tell that there's thought and intrigue behind it. When I was 8 or 10 years old and gorged my brain on horror, I thought if I met a vampire, I would want to talk to him. And yes, I had nightmares, and I thought I'd probably end up dead anyway. Would he talk to me? And I thought, if I'm going to be dead, maybe I'll just ask him anyway. Maybe that'll change his mind. Because I won't be the average mortal, because I'll be actually interested in his life. Next up, we have another author that probably a lot of you haven't heard of, Anthony Hyde. I did hear, I can't remember exactly where, before I picked up this book. I found it in a used bookstore. I heard that it was a mystery, but a little bit of a literary mystery. And that's sort of what I wanted to write at the time. So I picked this up, and it's still one of my favorite beginnings. As far as opening lines, being ominous, and I think all that characterizes too. You get a sense of the person through the setting, through the scene, through the first person aspect of it. I was to learn that all real secrets are buried, and that only ghosts speak the truth. So it was fitting, even for me, that all this began in a graveyard, among mysteries, memories, and lies. I mean, I didn't want to stop reading after that. To me, when I was into attempting to write a mystery, or I thought mystery, secrets, and lies buried in a graveyard, I'm all in. Next up, we have Toni Morrison's prize-winning classic Paradise. And that famous opening line, which you probably heard, they shoot the white girl first. But let's continue into the first paragraph and see how that plays out. They shoot the white girl first. With the rest, they can take their time. No need to hurry out here. They're 17 miles from a town, which has 90 miles between it and any other. Hiding places will be plentiful in the convent. Convent is with a capital C. But there is time, and the day has just begun. With just a few words, we have ominous setting. We have a scene that's grim of shooting the white girl and an ominous convent, or with a capital C, that we know is important and that it hints of the setting to come. I mean, that's a lot to get in a first sentence and in a first paragraph. But Toni Morrison did it beautifully, and she won the Nobel Prize. That says a lot. Think of also what we have in common up to this point. None of them are giving you a detailed description of a character. None of them are showing the character waking up and eating breakfast and going to work and going through the mondacities of their day-to-day life. This is something that is very much pulling you into the mystery of it. It's an overview glimpse of something that's curated for your curiosity, and that's important to factor in for every genre, because everything that we've picked up has had some form of that. It's had some balance of those three beginnings that we mentioned in some form or way. We either see the character in the setting, or we see the setting in the situation, and there's always that ominous portent. We know traditionally that the best beginnings will quickly show us a character. They're in trouble or heading for trouble. This type of beginning that we're seeing here, before we're even introduced to the character fully, we see that there's trouble. So by the time we see the character, we know they're walking into something ominous. We know they're walking into danger. We have a guy sitting in a room with a vampire who's like the top of the food chain in terms of predator, but he's willing to risk it for his interview. That also says something about the interviewer. There is a lot to be said for opening lines that give a little, that say a lot. Next up, we have the book that I'm reading to dissect for, I've actually just barely begun the book, but let's look at the opening line of Harry Potter. Whether you like Harry Potter or like J.K. Rowling's writing, and I know I've heard a few people that said they don't, but I think most people do. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. To me, that's a bit of an unconventional fantasy opening, but you also get an idea. They're so dead set against the strange and mysterious that you just know the strange and mysterious is about to happen. And in the subsequent paragraphs, it does. And lastly is Libra by Don DeLillo. I saved this for last because DeLillo is supposed to be a literary heavy hitter. And as I said in my book haul, I haven't actually read him, but this is one of his more popular novels. And in the beginning, we do see that even in the literary approach, we see a setting, and it's kind of an everyday setting, but it's made to feel a bit ominous. And we do see an eccentric character that's not exactly somebody who would be the norm, and that character is Lee Harvey Oswald. And the way he portrays this beginning, looking at everything that we've picked up so far, this was the year he rode the subway to the ends of the city, 200 miles of track. He liked to stand in the front of the first car, hands flat against the glass. The train smashed through the dark. People stood on local platforms staring nowhere, a look they'd been practicing for years. He kind of wondered, speeding past, who they really were. His body fluttered against the fastest stretches. They went so fast sometimes, he thought they were on the edge of no control. The noise was pitched to a level of pain he absorbed as a personal test. Another crazy-ass curve. There was so much iron in the sound of those curves, he could almost taste it, like a toy you put in your mouth when you were little. I mean, that's pretty damn good. And obviously, he's taking it as a personal test of pain. He's looking at those people that we see every day staring out into blankness. If you ever visited Manhattan, you see that every day. People don't connect. They don't make eye contact. They go about their business. They're on a trail that's entirely their own. They don't branch off it. They won't even talk to you without a good reason. Here we have this character who's on the verge, obviously, of losing control, and he's observing life, or we're observing life, through his point of view, and I think that's a great opening. I hope you've gleaned something from this little exercise for your own writing, and if you have any thoughts about openings or questions, leave them in the comment section below. We learn from everyone and everything, and that's why they say we should read widely. And that's why I put a hodgepodge mix books in here today, and why I read a hodgepodge mix, because you can see from the different genres, the different perspectives, the different level of writing, how it all comes together, how it works for authors who've actually been successful. There is something to be said for each of these. There's something in common for every genre on every level. They all portray that same level of the little that means a lot, the intrigue, the ominous, the danger factor, and hints at a character that may be walking on the edge of that danger, or riding a train and feeling the iron in his mouth like a toy that he chewed on during his childhood. There is something to be said for some of the writers, their eccentric paths, what brought them to the table of writing. And if you think of what brought you to the table, your own reasons, you may not have a spouse who's in MI6, but you have a story to tell. And when you look at everybody's story, everybody's level of intellect, everybody's level of prose, your story is important. It's all of value. It's all up for grabs. It just depends on what you do with it, and that's finding your own voice. And that's something that may come for another video. But for now, this comparison of openings is closed. Thanks for hanging with me today. I review these things and I keep learning all the time. And by going over what I know and going over new novels and old novels, we learn from one another's experience. So until next time, keep those keyboards clacking.